All right. Can you guys see that on that end? I'm going to assume you can. Yes? Oh, thank you, Mateo. All right, great. So last year I talked a little bit about the brain, and I was asked to come back and talk about the brain again. So what I want to do is share that all brains are not equal. I know here in the US, we taught sort of uniformly, and I've learned over the last 10 or 15 years that that's actually not the appropriate way to teach. The students are all at different levels, have different experiences, have different genetics, et cetera. So I'm going to share a few things that might be helpful to teachers mostly, but could also help administrators and other folks as well. And I'm going to start with this one quote that I really like, which is, "The great paradox of the brain is that everything you know about the world is provided to you by an organ that has itself never seen that world. The brain exists in silence and darkness, like a dungeoned prisoner. It has no pain receptors, literally no feelings. It has never felt warm sunshine or a soft breeze. To your brain, the world is just a stream of electric pulses, like taps of Morse code. And out of this bare and neutral information it creates for you, quite literally creates a vibrant, three-dimensional, centrally engaging universe. Your brain is you. Everything else is just plumbing and scaffolding." And I think that's really important to remember, that our brain literally creates our environment for us. It is a prediction engine, and it uses our past and existing experience, either internally or externally, to create a world that we experience. And everyone experiences the world in a completely different way than everyone else. If you will, there are about 8 billion different brains out in the world. So knowing this, I will ask you this question, that if you actually knew the few key things that would more fully engage your students and accelerate their learning, what would it mean to you? So I'm going to give you a second, and I'll ask you to just write that down in front of you, or if you're remote, you can type it into something. And I'd like you to look back at that as I go through my slides over the next 15, 20, 30 minutes. And if you want to write it in the chat, if you're remote, please feel free. It'd be great to see some of the things that are coming across of what it would mean to you. And it can be just a word or a phrase or a sentence, paragraph, whatever you'd like. All right, so let me just run through the agenda while you're writing that down. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the science that I've learned. I'm not a scientist, just so we're clear, but I've been studying neuroscience for about 20 years and have found that understanding how the brain works, even at a fundamental level, made a huge difference in my life. It actually created me, it caused me to be a much more compassionate human being than I was before. Because in the end, we're all kind of crazy. We're all highly emotional, irrational, impulsive beings. And knowing that can make a big difference in how you see others. I think you're more willing to give the benefit of the doubt than you have in the past. What I'll also do is talk about that brains are like fingerprints. And this is from some work by a scientist called Janke. Our brains start off with about twice as many neurons as we end up with. And in our first few years of life, our brain mostly goes through a pruning process, a process where it eliminates a lot of things as it goes. And our experience, our genetics, and other things are really the drivers of that. So even if you're raised in the same family, because you were brought up a year later or 2 years later or 3 years later, your brain will turn out very differently than your siblings. That's why I'm sure those of us who have parents and have more than one child always wonder, where did some of these kids come from? They're so different from each other. They develop, as I mentioned, on genetics and experience. So you'll get a lot of your development will be just from your parents, the DNA you get from your parents, but very much it'll also be affected by your experience. So this is sort of the whole nature versus nurture situation. And it's not nature versus nurture, it's nature and nurture. Your brain develops a lot because of what you're exposed to, who you're exposed to, what concepts and beliefs you're exposed to as well. And learning takes place when brains connect the new to the old. One of the things that I've learned, I'm a bit of a teacher as well, just not in a classroom. The best way to get folks to learn is to find something that they already have comfort with and a familiarity with, and try to connect that to the new concept that they have. And I'll talk a little bit more in depth on this in a minute. And actually, our learning stalls or halts when these building blocks are not formed. So you may notice that, especially if you layer your teaching over time, and I think math is probably the best subject that this applies to, because a lot of the concepts that we learned later in math are building on things we already know. So fundamental, subtraction, addition, multiplication, division, onto simple algebra, to other things as well. If you miss some of those things or you don't get the concept really well, your learning will be impacted tremendously and your brain just won't be able to catch up. That's why I love the new technology and the new tools that are out there that allows the classroom teacher to get much closer to customizing the experience for each individual student, or at least cohorts of students, with the technology, like stuff from Edves and other places as well. So here's a great picture of sort of the fingerprints. So I'll start you off at the top, and the red box where it says each brain is unique and uniquely organized. Again, this is from DNA, this is genetics and your life experiences, which leads to all brains to the right. If we go on my screen, all brains are not equal because context and ability influence learning. This is the whole point of people. Our brains are not equal. We learn different ways. There are different kinds of brains that are out there, and creating a uniform teaching environment is actually not beneficial, except to those folks that it fits into. I know it makes it much more difficult as a teacher, but creating context for them and understanding their abilities can help someone. Someone might be much more visual, much more textual. You have to sort of use different modes. And some students you have to spend a little more time with in a certain area, and some kids you don't. And some of the time you spend with someone in one area where they're struggling doesn't mean that they're going to struggle in all areas. It just might be that particular area itself. And the brain is skilled by knowledge. The brain is changed by knowledge, skills, and previous experiences. As many of you probably know, our brain is what's called plastic, meaning that it never stops changing. You've seen this, you've experienced it yourself. A lot of insight that we get, which are new thoughts, new experience that we have, new fusing of brain connections. We all get. We often get them like in the shower or on a run, or just usually when we're not doing something, we're letting our brain rest, and something will come to you and like in a flash. That's your brain connecting two things that maybe weren't connected before, and now for some reason, through the context of what you're doing, will reconnect. I mentioned the brain is highly plastic. We have new and old brain wiring. It's called neurogenesis, which is basically the development of new neurons. And this happens all the way through our lives, all the way through up to when we die. As I mentioned, the brain connects new information to old. Using metaphor and other concepts that people can get, or having them think about, like what I did at the beginning is I asked you to sort of think about what would this mean to you if you're able to sort of change the lives of students by learning a few key things. That's allowing you to think about what you have, and as you hold that in your brain, maybe something that I say will spark an insight, or you'll find a pattern. That's a great way to help your students learn. And what's really important, I'll talk a little bit more about in depth in this, is sort of how we learn, is helping folks to pay attention, your students to pay attention, or anyone, your own children, your staff, finding ways to help them really focus on what you're trying to do, and helping them enhance their memory really is an essence of learning. Repetition, once someone gets the concept, repetition within that concept accelerates learning. And we'll talk a little bit more of that as well in a few minutes. So this is a little bit of a review from last time that I was here, just to remind everyone that the brain really has two main functions. And really the main function is to keep the rest of you alive. Our brains, the last time our brains had an upgrade was somewhere between 10 and 50,000 years ago. So what you are using your brain for today it was not designed to do. It fools you on a regular basis because it's really trying to avoid threat, and it avoids threat at 2 times the amount of when it tries to go for, when it tries to go for reward. This is called a negativity bias. And sometimes we, especially those of us in a position of authority, inadvertently put our constituents, our students, the people that work for us, et cetera, into a threat mode. We all do it. We do it without knowing it. The most feared phrase in business, and it might be in school as well, is, "Hey, can I give you a little feedback?" And that actually puts the brain into threat mode immediately because our brain doesn't like feedback. It doesn't understand the difference between a physical threat and a social threat. It acts the exact same way. And there's a really cool thing, a little fun fact that I learned. If you actually have a broken heart, you can help to heal your heart with aspirin. The same pain receptors that go when you have a physical pain, they light up when you have an emotional pain. I've actually done this myself, and it worked great. So it's just kind of interesting to learn that. And then lastly, you'll see that your brain is looking for reward or threat. Are you a friend or a foe? About 5 times every second, according to some science. So this is happening on a regular basis with your kids sitting in the classroom, or the people that work for you. So it's really important to remember that. And one of the things that you can keep in mind, again, is something I did last time, is there's a model called the SCARF model. And these are the things that the brain is assessing on a regular basis. What is the status that I'm in? Do I have certainty? Do I have some autonomy? Is there some relatedness, and is there fairness? And I'm going to go through each of one of these quickly to give a little more depth. So what is status? Status is, what is my relative importance to others? So if you're the teacher, you clearly have status over the rest of the class. And you have to remember that their brains are saying that, I'm lower than this person. If you can create that sort of psychological safety where you at least mitigate that hierarchy within the classroom, you'll actually enhance learning than sort of being in the front of the class and helping people, pointing out things that they're wrong on. That'll put them in more of a threat status. And again, the brain doesn't know the difference. The next is, of course, certainty. And this is, am I able to predict the future? Are you, as the teacher or the administrator, giving me an understanding of what's going to happen? Are you outcome related? Hiding the outcome or what you're trying to accomplish actually, again, puts people into a threat mode inadvertently, and shuts the best part of their brain off, that you want to be thinking and being creative and innovative. So it's important to say, if you start a meeting, you say, here's what we're expecting to come out of this meeting. Here's what I'm expecting for each of you to bring to this meeting. And hopefully you have told them beforehand so they're well prepared. Same thing in a classroom. You want to provide some sort of outcome related understanding so that the kids know where you're headed. The next is autonomy. Do I have a sense of control over the events that are going here, or are they completely out of my control? Really important to make sure that people understand that they are in charge of what they're doing, and you're sort of the guide to help them. Whether it be, again, be in a meeting or in a classroom, you want to give them a sense of control over events. There are so many events that are out of our control. I mean, COVID is an excellent example. We really can't control a lot of things that go around in our lives. So if you can give that to your students or to the people that work for you, it helps them to be more engaged and more productive and actually more fulfilled and happy. So autonomy is really important. The next is relatedness. And this is really, am I in the in group or am I in the out group? If I'm in the out group, again, your brain is 10 to 50,000 years old. And being in the out group to your brain is a threat to their existence. And that will cause pain and suffering that you didn't even know you were doing. So if you can be inclusive and make sure that you pull people together, that would be great. There was a great experiment that a teacher did here in the United States a number of years ago. And she said that all the kids with the blue eyes were smarter than the kids with the brown eyes. And she reinforced that. And guess what happened? The scores of the kids with the brown eyes went down, and the scores of the kids with the blue eyes went up. And then the next week, she reversed it and said, oh, I was wrong. I'm sorry. It's actually the brown-eyed kids that are much smarter than the blue-eyed kids. And guess what happened? The exact opposite. Now the brown-eyed kids felt more smart and actually got better scores on the tests that week. So it's amazing what impact you have in what you say. There is power in words. And if you can make sure that everyone's connected and feel inclusive, it has a great impact on them. And then lastly, I sort of joke that we all have what's called I call a fairness gene. We don't like things that are unfair or we perceive as unfair. And there's a great experiment that's been done dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of times over decades. It's called the dilemma game. And it is an interesting game because it's two strangers who don't see each other, and one of them gets $10 or $20, but whatever the amount is, but let's say it's $10. And that person who has the $10 can give as much or as little as they want to the other person. The other person has the opportunity to accept or reject the money. And what's interesting is in many cases, if the person who has the $10 gives $3 or less to the other person, they reject it. Now, this is completely irrational because neither of them had $10 to start with. So any amount of money is more than you had. But because we sort of have this perception of fair exchange, we're willing to bring pain and suffering to ourselves, if you will, because we don't think it's fair. We would rather not take the money than to sort of sanction that the person who gave us the money unfairly was doing the right thing. As you can imagine, that is completely irrational, but that's who we are. We are highly emotional, irrational, impulsive beings. And understanding that with your students and your folks is really important. So let's do a quick review. The brain itself in each one is unique and uniquely organized. And as a teacher, especially understanding this and trying to customize as much as possible how you teach, using the tools that are available with technology. There are some great tools that I've seen that can break down each student into very specific components and attributes and see where each of them stands against where you're the standard that you're trying to set. You want to try to create this environment of psychological safety. I touched on it a little bit, but psychological safety as a definition is from a woman by the name of Amy Edmondson here in the United States. And she's a Harvard Business School professor and researcher. And her definition of psychological safety is that you feel like it's okay to be a human being, to admit mistakes, to tell people when you did something wrong, or say, I'm sorry, or I need help. And if you can create that environment within your classroom, within your school, again, you'll create an environment of success and velocity, and have a sense of teamwork where people feel that they're part of something that they feel safe in. And as a leader, it's really it's important for you to set that standard. You have to say, I need some help here. I don't know what I'm doing, or, that thing I said last week, I'm really sorry. I wasn't feeling well. Something happened at home or whatever it might be. If you show that you're a human being, you'll give them permission to also be human beings. And that will create this wonderful environment. Obviously, you don't want people to go too far, but I think people are generally good-minded. And that's the SCARF model that we talked about, which is status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness, is one model that I think really helps with that safety bit. So my last section here will be, how does the brain learn? Again, this is a little bit of a review from last time. So those of you who were here last year will hopefully recognize this. And the brain learns, according to the Neuroleadership Institute, as you see down in the corner there, through four things. And they call it the AGES model, as you can see: attention, generation, emotions, and spacing. So what is attention? Attention is you have about 90 seconds to get your audience's attention. You can do that in myriad ways. The way I did it was I had a sort of a funny and interesting quote at the beginning by Bill Bryson. And hopefully that got some attention from some of you. In a classroom, you actually have everyone's attention, if you did that and you did it well, for about 10 minutes. And then from some research that's out there, you have to regain it again after 10 minutes. And then you have another 10 minutes. And somewhere between the third and fourth 10 minutes, you don't have to do it as often. So if you have a 50-minute class, you probably have to do it 2 or 3 times. And there's this gentleman, Dr. Medina, out in University of Washington, who does this on a regular basis. He has a great book called Brain Rules. If you want to read that, it shows a whole bunch of things. And I love the section on teaching that he talks about attention, how to get attention, and then how to keep attention. The next thing is generation. And this is really important, is our brain recalls things to which it has multiple connections. So for instance, if we take the word apple, Apple has a lot of connections. One is, it may be the crunch sound. It could be the color, it's red. It could be the taste. It could be the time of year. It could be a reminder of when your grandmother made apple pie for you or something else. So the more connections that something has, the more likely it is your brain is going to help you remember it, because it says, well, there's, it's sort of like Google, right? If there are a lot of links to a particular word, it's much more likely to come up first. It's very similar to your brain from that perspective. That's called generation. The other is emotions. We've all experienced this. I'm sure right now, if I asked you to remember something highly emotional, probably negatively emotional, you can remember with great detail of what happened. Emotions play a huge part in memory and recall. If you can create an environment where the emotions of your audience are heightened, it can be positive or negative, hopefully more positive than negative, but either way works. It has a huge impact on what you do and what you remember. This applies, this is a great example. My daughter's in college. She's a senior here in the United States, actually in Ithaca, New York. And we talked about study groups, and study groups actually create a tension that allows your brain to sort of forces your brain to remember things, because you have this social pressure. There's this emotion that's created from the social pressure of being in this group. You want to contribute. You want to feel like you're being seen in a positive way by your peers. You want to feel good about yourself, about knowing something and sharing it with your teams. This is why study groups work tremendously well. As a way for people to learn, is because it heightens the emotion a little bit and causes your brain to be a little more energetic and hopefully remember it. And the last is spacing. And the example I have for this is flashcards. Maybe you do this with your students, or maybe you've done this before. There's a method, I think it's called the Leitner method. And I used it when I became a coach, because I had to pass a test, an oral test about 5 or 6 years ago. And I was given all the content. So I wrote it down on cards, and then I quizzed myself, so I put the question on the front, and then I put the answer on the back. And if I got the answer right, I put it in one pile. If I got the answer wrong, I put it in another. And if I sort of got the answer right, I put it in a middle pile. And then what I did is I combined the second and third pile, which were the ones that I got wrong and the ones that I sort of got right. And then I studied them, and then I quizzed myself again. And I did this, I think for several weeks, and I kept going over and over and over again until I could go through the entire set 3 times in a row with no errors. And when I took the test, I took it with a gentleman who had been giving it for years. And when I was done, he just smiled at me and said, "I think that was the fastest that anyone has ever gone through the entire test." And it was about an hour test, and I did it in 37 minutes. And it was, I think, had a great impact was this method that I used, because I used this sort of spacing method. I not only had the emotion of getting things wrong, but I did it over 3 or 4 weeks. So my brain kept seeing the information, and I kept trying to recall it, and it really said, "Oh, this is important stuff. I keep seeing this over and over and over again." So it stored it in a different place for me. So when it was time for me to take the test, it was in long-term memory, so I could recall it more easily. And just to show you that the hippocampus is really the center of this. Is really the place. It's sort of a traffic cop. It says, okay, which information do we get rid of? What do we ignore? And which information do we store here for a short amount of time and for a longer amount of time? Where do I put it somewhere else? So the hippocampus is, from a biological perspective, is really that section of your brain that does this. So when you're a teacher, or even any administrator where you're trying to help people to learn something, keeping this in mind is great. And I highly recommend that you Google it. There's a lot more information than I'm giving you here on how to do this and examples. It's also in a couple of books by Dr. David Rock, who is the head of the Neuroleadership Institute. There's some great videos on YouTube on it as well. I highly recommend if you want to have your class remember things and learn faster, this is a great method to use. All right, so as a review, again, each brain is unique and uniquely organized. You want to create this psychologically safe environment through this SCARF model or another model, but this is the one I like, with status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. Then, of course, we have the AGES model for learning, attention, generation, emotion, and spacing. And then here's what I'd recommend that you do to help you. One is, as I mentioned already, leverage the tools and technology that facilitate the ability to uniquely reach each brain where it is at that moment in time. You don't have to necessarily go around to each child individually, but you can give them, again, ask a question about metaphor and say, here's what we're going to be talking about. Can you think of an instance in your life or something that you're familiar with that is closely related to this? And then have them share it with each other, because sometimes they can help each other. And then you can connect that to what you're trying to teach. It's an amazing tool, because if your brain cannot see something that it's familiar with, the person will not learn what you're trying to teach them. The brain just doesn't know where to make the connection. And what's really fascinating to me, it physically makes the connection. It connects one set of neurons to another set of neurons when they learn something. That sort of flash of insight is when that electrical connection is made. And then lastly, keep the brain in mind throughout the day. If you're, again, a teacher, administrator, whatever it is, think about, am I being brain friendly? And even though Mr. Bryson says the brain is you, I sort of think the brain is actually more what you've inherited from your ancestors, and you're molding it to be you. And understanding a little bit about how the brain is, how it works, and trying to be brain friendly, where you're not putting people inadvertently into threat mode, where you're understanding the status, certainty, autonomy, etc. You try to move people more towards reward than threat throughout the day, throughout the class, etc. You'll actually enhance the learning process and the growing process. And then again, keep in mind how the brain actually learns, through that attention, generation, emotion, and spacing. I think it will serve you extremely well. It has served me extremely well as being a sort of a teacher of what I do over the last 4 or 5 years. So that's my bit. Hopefully I made up some time for the group. And I'm happy to take any questions in the chat, but if not, I'll let the compare take back over. All right, I guess there are no questions, so I can't hear you, Matthew. You're on mute. All good? All right, then I guess I will leave you. Thank you very much. Have a great weekend. Thanks for having me again. I appreciate it. Cheers.